Who owns space? Who gets to benefit from its resources? And who gets to access it? These were some of the most contentious issues, both in the lead up to what later became the first Outer Space Treaty and in today's governance of the global commons. And the fact that those issues have persisted for so long, I argue in this presentation, is not accidental. I'm going to bring this point in three stages. First, I'm going to talk about the promise of the first article of the Outer Space Treaty, a promise between global north and south to ensure that outer space would be used in a way that would balance freedom and equity for all. I will then discuss a problem with that has arisen both in the drafting of that article and in its later practice. Finally, I will talk about a potential path forward, a way of re-examining this issue to emphasize the us and the I's of the situation. Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty had to strike a tense balance between two opposing concepts, the free use of outer space and the equitable use of outer space. The former was generally progressed by the global north, which were very much based their proposals on equality, whereas the latter were more presented by the global south and were proposals more based in ideas of equity. For the global south, most of which 40 new countries had just joined the UN between the first satellite in orbit and the first space treaty's conclusion, the idea of equity in the face of a brand new terrain was an assurance against the colonial expansion that they were by then far familiar with. Unfortunately, the balance that was reached was not exactly in the middle. And the first issue that I'll point out that caused this was what I call the res communis problem. Namely, in discussions at the UN level and also across academic literature, every solution or governance mechanism that fell in the middle of this spectrum of free use on one hand and equitable use on the other, everything between those extremes was at some point referred to as res communis. Unfortunately, the words used to describe mechanisms to manage the commons were largely non-descriptive or non-explanatory, and in fact generally obscured the meanings that they were being applied. Now, most importantly, res communis as a term changed depending on who was speaking and where they were from. The global south meant res communis as a much more definitionally thick term, a term based in equity, a term that they viewed as referencing existing rights and rules of international law. They saw this as an idea that would qualify or limit the free use of space, that indeed was the promise that they sought, and that would ensure a system based on common property that was governed by the international community as a whole. Global North saw things very differently. But this isn't just a case of a conversation out of sync, of people talking and not hearing each other. It's slightly more nuanced and insidious than that. Through the process of reassociation of ideas, an idea from critical race theory popularized recently by Adam Gedeshu, the global north was able to disassemble the constituent elements of the global south's res communi proposals and reconstruct an idea that was built in their image, one that served their geopolitical agendas, one that was palatable to their interests. That was, in the end, what resulted in Outer Space Treaty Article 1. And a similar process is unfortunately why the Moon Treaty later failed as well, the Common Heritage regime. A specific example of how this underserved the Global South is present in these two quotes. The first is from the representative of Mexico to the ad hoc UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in 1959. And he cited a Latin tradition that saw legal problems first from the general principle level, talking about ideas of natural justice rather than either practice in space or positivism, which the global north purportedly was much more focused on. They had a different way of going about the issue based on their specific legal contexts. On the other hand, Africa was similarly underserved by the resulting status quo, whereas Latin American proposals were heard at the time and since sidelined in practice. African states were largely silent or silenced during the conclusion of the Outer Space Treaty, especially sub-Saharan Africa. African states, unfortunately, could very much have been valuable sources for different ways of thinking about common land management in the global commons. Of course, they're enculturated in a lot of communities towards communal land ownership going back thousands of years, and would have perhaps viewed ideas like res communis or even common heritage regimes much differently. Unfortunately, that Chavo does not exist, and the work of the Latin American contributions to the early Outer Space Treaty has unfortunately since then become rather put out of use. The balance struck in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty in the end resulted in a system that paid lip service to both sides while guaranteeing neither. And in the face of that indeterminacy, the global North's power and operational capability in space has enabled them to shift the balance towards free use of space in a way that was never intended by quite a large majority of the international community. So where do we go from here? The broken promise of the Outer Space Treaty between North and South is that equity would be a principle that limited freedom. Unfortunately, we have not seen that at the moment. However, I hope to make three arguments, each one perhaps seeming rather disjointed, but together leading to a potential solution that is based both in existing and ongoing developments in international law, and might be more conducive towards reaching or at least seeing new solutions. The first argument I hope to make is that near-Earth space is the environment, and I mean that both conceptually and in the sense that it is governed by environmental law. My first argument in support of this is that international law generally applies in space under Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty. Secondly, environmental obligations follow states as they act in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And third, historically speaking, near-Earth space was widely seen at the time of the Outer Space Treaty's conclusion as being within the environment, and in fact, debris was seen as an environmental concern. Finally, my last argument is more ethically based. As humanity expands, our environment, at least I think, should expand with us, and so should our ways of governing it. My second of three arguments is that near-Earth orbits are themselves limited resources. Resource is a term international law does not conclusively define, but we have a clue in that the geostationary orbit is indeed a limited resource per the ITU constitution. Interestingly, the phrasing of that clause is in fact quite non-exhaustive, and it's worth pointing out that orbit boundaries in general are generally soft law. Near-Earth orbits, by the way, share the same qualifications or characteristics as GEO that make GEO a common pool resource. Near-Earth orbits are just as subtractable and unexcludable as those orbits. Finally, near-Earth orbits are increasingly valuable and increasingly competitive. With that correlates with an increasing level of risk from debris contamination. And a resource regime, I think, is a way of analyzing that restores the urgency of the problem at hand. Finally, I argue that debris risk is a human rights issue, and specifically risks our right to an environment or orbital environment. This is one of my more bombastic arguments, perhaps, but I argue that the right to environment is itself an ethical framework that allows us to recenter the us in orbit. Maybe someday it will be a binding legal one, but for now, I'm satisfied with just turning the issue on its head in our minds. The human rights approach helps to test drive the right to environment as it's applied on Earth. Greening the rights to life and health does not work in an environment so extreme as to not impact those so directly. But what happens when harm involves harm to development for generations in the future? Is that any less harmful in some ways? I'd argue not. The right to environment, recognized by 80% of the UN, in theory, could really benefit from being used in space. Finally, debris assessment in the human rights context helps to reincarnate the Global South's common regime proposals, which were based in collective rights across history, and respect their current legal traditions and later practice, including that which we've sidelined and silenced since. This approach in general helps to restore agency to purported beneficiaries of orbital projects, allowing for more nuanced tests of cost and benefit using ideas like proportionality. In conclusion, the first article of the Outer Space Treaty balanced freedom and equity in a way that attempted to promise something to the global North and South, that equity would limit freedom. That promise, unfortunately, is largely still unfulfilled. Global South state practice was across the board mediated through legal and cultural contexts that the global North didn't just fail to understand, but also intentionally reassociated, sidelined, and silenced. Finally, environmental rights could present an ethical framework that would help us recenter equity, agency, and even maybe some form of space citizenship when we're discussing the issue of space debris. Thank you.